Welcome back, night travelers. Lock your doors, hush the house, and listen. The snow outside New England barns once carried two sets of footprints, one from the living, one from the dead. Tonight, we follow both. They said the nights were longer then. Lamps guttered in farmhouse windows while frost wrote lace on the panes. In the rafters, hay slept alongside hope. In the pantry, jars of summer peaches glowed like tiny suns. But in the bedrooms, a cough sawed through the dark. It began as a tickle, a weariness, a pallor that no broth could mend. A boy faded, then a sister, then the mother. And when the father's cheek hollowed and his breath turned thin as thread, someone finally whispered the word they were not supposed to know. Vampire. You can laugh at that word now, safe in your century, but a century offers less protection than you think. Imagine the room. 3 chairs close to the stove, a Bible on the table, the doctor's bag snapping open like a trap. He can measure pulses, he can prescribe rest, but he cannot keep the night from breathing against the glass. Death was not an event, it was a season. It tasted like iron keys and cold bread. It sounded like a shovel nudging a stone. New England is supposed to be a place of sober minds, schoolmasters, ministers, town meetings. Yet the soil tells another story. The soil remembers the nights when men with lanterns and rope crossed the frozen ground toward the burying hill. They were not criminals. They were fathers who loved their children, brothers who feared for their sisters, neighbors who had watched too many candles burn down to nubs beside beds that never warmed again. They were desperate. Desperation has a ritual. First, there is the consultation. Someone tells a certain story, the story that belongs to a friend of a friend in a neighboring town, how the wasting sickness stopped after they made things right with the grave. No one wants to be the first to nod. No one wants to be the one who names the cure. Then the silence breaks. A minister clears his throat, says that men are prone to superstition, but he pockets his opinion when the father's eyes turned red and raw. The doctor says nothing and looks at his boots. The oldest woman in the room, the one who was buried 6, ties her shawl and begins to list the tools they'll need. They go near midnight, because they must, and because it feels appropriate. The burying ground is not far. New England towns were built tight, with death only a short walk from the baker, the smith, the schoolhouse. Frost pops in the cedars. The lanterns draw little circles of gold that jump with each step, as if the light itself is afraid. Headstones rise and tilt like teeth. Names stand out in capital letters: Abigail, Ruth, Samuel, Prudence. The date stacks shorter than you think. No one lived long enough to waste time. They find the mound they want. It is not the oldest grave, which would be safe. It is not the newest, which would be indecent. It is the grave of the one who died at the hinge of a family's ruin, the sister whose passing began the cough, the son whose departure left a seat at supper that sucked heat from the room. They kneel. Someone speaks a prayer that ends as a sigh. The first shovel lifts a square of earth and sets it aside like a folded coat. You can pretend this is only a legend if it comforts you, but the records exist, written in the tight, steady hands of selectmen and clerks who preferred numbers to nightmares. Inventory of a farm, inventory of a house, and then, politely, inventory of the grave. Inside the coffin, if the rumors are true, there will be signs. Flesh that has not withered, blood where there should be dust, a heart that seems unaccountably full. None of this makes sense if you believe the dead behave as they should. All of it makes a terrible sense if you believe the dead are still visiting their families at night, feeding on them like a private tax. The hinges complain, the lid lifts, breath fogs, then pauses. Lanterns lean close. And there you are, face to face with the person you loved most in the world, made suddenly into evidence. Even if the truth is ordinary,
skin tight from the cold, hair seeming longer because skin shrank from the follicles, lips darkened by the chemistry of rot. It does not feel ordinary. Grief requires answers that science has not yet learned to give. What they do next depends on the town and the century, on who kept watch and who looked away. In one place, they will slice the heart and take it to a field. The fire will be small and stubborn, fed with brush that snaps green, fed with oaths muttered through teeth that cannot stop chattering. The heart will char, then ash. Someone will mix it with water or milk. Someone will carry the cup back to the house and hold it to the lips of the dying father, who will swallow because he wants to live, because he wants the world to go on containing his children. In another place, they will turn the bones and rest the skull between the femurs, a warning to the body to mind its business. In another place, they will do nothing at all, and still the cough will pass, and still they will remember, and still the story will harden into truth. Do not call them ignorant. Remember what they faced. A disease that no one could name with authority, a wasting that took the strongest and spared the old, as if cruelty had chosen a method. Rooms with poor air, winters with poor heat, farms with poor margins. It is not unintelligent to want an enemy you can touch. It is not irrational to ask fear to point at something. They picked the thing that lay closest to them and gave fear a direction.
Morning after such nights is always bright, as if the sun wants to deny what it saw. The neighbors exchange looks over fence rails. Children stick to their chores and step around the subject as if it were a hole in the yard. The minister preaches on faith and works, on the heart's deceit and the mind's weakness, and he does not mention the smoke that rose from the field. The doctor visits, listens, writes, hopes, and sometimes, because diseases have their own calendars and cruelties, the father regains weight and color. The house warms. The cough fades. No one credits heat and time. Everyone credits what they need to credit. In this light, the word vampire is not a monster. It is a measurement. It measures how much fear a family can hold, how much love a town can spend in one night, how far people will go when the rules of the day fail them. The monster is merely the hinge on which the door of action turns. Open, and the night rushes in. But let us walk back a pace from the grave and look at the hill. There are dozens of stones here, hundreds across the county, each a door with a name. Behind the letters stand stories you and I do not know. The miller who drowned in spring flood, the midwife who stitched more than cloth, the child who learned letters by tracing her father's name on slate. When the panic came, it did not come as a single roar. It passed stone to stone like frost, a quiet claim that the dead could be blamed for the living. In barns, men discussed it while oil lamps shook. In kitchens, women weighed it while bread rose and fell. In fields, children heard it without being told, the way children always do. You may ask, where were the skeptics, the ones who stood up and said no? They were there, of course. Some were brave, some were tired. Some said that the world was already heavy, and we need not carry old fear on top of new grief. But skeptics have a hard time when coughs rack the bed and no remedy works. They have a hard time when a mother looks at them with eyes that have measured all the miles between hope and surrender. Even a skeptic will carry a lantern if the night is cold enough. The geography did not help. New England towns stitched their houses to hills where frost clings longest. The forests pushed close, full of noises that modern ears have foreclosed. The roads went crooked around stones older than history. In such places, sound travels in odd ways. A cough can be heard from the other side of a wall, like a hand tapping your shoulder. A rumor can cross a mile the way a hawk crosses a pasture without asking permission. By the time a doctor arrives with Latin sagacity, the rumor has already taken the room's chair. We like to think we are kinder to the dead than our ancestors were, but kindness depends on context. They did not desecrate to mock. They made alliances with fear to bargain for life.
When they opened the grave, they were knocking on a door that had shut too soon, asking, "Please, one more chance." The first shovel is always a prayer. The second is a promise. The third is a confession. We will do anything.
In the evenings that followed, the air inside houses felt different, lighter sometimes, as if an invisible debt had been paid. Heavier other times, as if a new sin had been added to the ledger. Children who slept poorly crept to their parents' room and listened to their breathing, counting the rise and fall as if numbers could guard a life. Neighbors walked home from church in pairs. Dogs howled at fences. Chickens roosted early. And if the moon rode high and pale, it looked, to certain eyes, like a watchful coin in a sky that kept exacting payment. The chapter of panic does not begin with a name like mercy or an act like exhumation. It begins here, in the pressure of a room where nothing helps, in the small arithmetic of hope that trades on impossible exchange rates. It begins in the sound a latch makes when a door opens to a winter night and a man with a lantern says, "We are going up the hill." It begins with a woman who does not say no. It begins with the way the stars look when you are carrying a shovel. We could stop at the threshold and call the story done. Let darkness keep its polite distance. But the truth waits beyond, patient as a stone. Over the next nights, the fear will take voices and addresses. It will learn to introduce itself at the door with a hat in its hands. It will sign its name in town ledgers and be filed in church minutes under disturbance at the burying ground. It will travel from Rhode Island to Connecticut, from Vermont to the papers in Boston and New York, where tidy columns will fail to contain the heat of what they describe. The panic will develop customs, artifacts, rules. It will invent logic with enough edges to cut any argument to the shape it needs. For now, take one more step with me. Put your hand on the gate. Feel the iron cold against your palm. The hinges shriek, then forgive. The path climbs. Your breath follows you in small clouds that vanish as you watch them, which feels like an omen you do not want to name. Beneath your boots, frost snaps in small determinations. In your pocket, the matches knock against the little tin like a heartbeat. Behind you, the windows of the house glow, then darken, one by one, as if the place itself is closing its eyes against what you are about to do. At the top of the hill, the headstones stand like a jury that already knows your verdict. Some wear lichen like old men wear wool. Some have fallen, turned into shelves for snow. You find the name you have said too many times these past months and lay a gloved hand against the stone. The letters are shallow and cold. The date is recent enough to feel like a fresh bruise. Around you, the men clear their throats and pretend they are alone. The spade enters the earth. It resists, then yields. There is a rhythm to the work. The rhythm is older than this hill. It is older than the town below. It is the rhythm of panic, married to love.
When the lid lifts, when the lanterns lean, when the air in the coffin sighs out like the last word of a secret, you will look down and recognize a face you know by heart. And in that moment, the world will split along a narrow seam between the thing you believe and the thing you need. On one side is the neat sermon, the physician's certainty, the tidy God of Sunday. On the other is the raw God of winter nights, who takes bargains, who listens to desperate prayers spoken with shovels. You will not choose with your mind. You will choose with the ache inside your chest, the ache that has been there since the coughing started, the ache that woke you at 3 in the morning and sent you to the window to watch the moon. This is where our story begins, with the living asking the dead to return what was taken, even if it means lighting a small, stubborn fire in a field where frost keeps trying to put it out. Call it superstition if you must. Tonight, call it a door. We will go through it together. They called it consumption, a beautiful word for a cruel disease. It consumed the flesh, the breath, the color in the cheeks, until nothing was left but bone and a whisper. Doctors wrote theses in neat Latin. Neighbors called it the wasting sickness. But the families who watched it creep from one bed to the next had another word hiding in their throats, something older, darker, and far less reasonable. In the 1800s, New England did not yet know about bacteria. Germ theory was an argument in distant cities, not a fact in the fields of Rhode Island or the hills of Vermont. People lived close to the land and closer to their dead. Graves were shallow. Illness was constant, and death came like a visitor who knocked politely only once. When the first cough began, no one panicked. When it lingered through spring and stole weight from the strong, when it moved from brother to sister, then to mother, then father, panic became the only language left. Imagine the house, timbers warped from long winters, a single stove breathing its faint heat. The sick lay near the window because doctors said sunlight might help. But sunlight did little against the cough that clawed at ribs and sprayed blood on handkerchiefs. The family prayed, but prayer had already failed in a dozen neighboring farms. The minister spoke of faith, the doctor of rest. Both walked away, leaving silence behind. Only the fear stayed. The disease spread like gossip. A town might lose 1 or 2 each year, but when entire families began to vanish, reason thinned. Every night someone heard stories. Someone knew a man in another village who swore his daughter came back in dreams, pale and begging. Someone else had seen shadows move across snow when no living foot was near. Stories traveled faster than horses. Tuberculosis had its rhythm. The deep hacking cough, the blood, the fever, the slow wasting. Yet in the mind of a community that had seen too much loss, these signs became proof of something unnatural. How else could so many die in one house while another family thrived down the road? Why did the sickness seem to stalk only one bloodline? Why did the newly dead look too whole, too pink when the coffin opened?
One rumor leads to another, and soon the idea of a restless corpse takes hold. The living begin to search for causes in the grave. The logic is simple, brutal, and comforting. If you can name the thing killing you, maybe you can stop it. A father whose children cough through the night finds strength in that thought. He convinces himself that a single act, terrible but necessary, will save whoever remains. Doctors traveling the countryside tried to explain what was happening. They spoke of miasma, bad air, and the invisible poisons that float from swamps. They blamed damp houses, poor diet, the cold. They didn't know they were standing at the edge of discovery. They only knew that their remedies failed. Quinine, cod liver oil, laudanum. Nothing worked, and when medicine fails, magic waits its turn. In a farmhouse in Connecticut, the neighbors gathered. Another girl had died. Another brother coughed blood onto his pillow. They whispered of the next town, where the same plague had stopped after a grave was opened. One man swore on his Bible that he had seen the corpse's heart still wet, the mouth stained red. He said the father burned it and fed the ashes to the sick, and by spring the family lived. That story moved like wind through the rafters, and no science on earth could slow it. So the living went to the burying ground. The disease had taught them that time was short, that waiting meant another coffin. They dug through frozen dirt, listening to the creak of spades. Some said prayers, others only stared at their boots. The coffin came up slick with frost. The lid pried open. Inside, the dead looked peaceful, too peaceful. There was still color in the lips, a smear of dark fluid at the corners of the mouth. Breath caught in the throats of the watchers. Proof. What they did next was supposed to save them. They cut, burned, scattered. The smell of smoke drifted into the sleeping town. By morning, the snow was streaked with ash, and everyone waited to see who would wake without coughing. Sometimes the sick rallied, sometimes they didn't. But belief has its own evidence. When one man's fever broke, it was enough. The panic gained another convert. For the next decade, New England lived with two plagues, one of disease, one of imagination. Families kept watch on graves. Ministers preached longer sermons. The few doctors who spoke against the superstition found their words ignored. The towns were small, isolated, bound by winter roads and fear. When you live that close to the edge, myth becomes medicine.
And still the real sickness traveled, unbothered by ritual or fire. It moved from lungs to lungs, from breath to breath, unseen, unpunished. The people fought shadows while the plague walked in daylight. In this way, tuberculosis became the perfect disguise for a vampire. Slow, patient, always feeding. By the end of the century, scientists would name the culprit and isolate the bacillus. But by then, New England had already written its darker version of the truth. In old diaries and local newspapers, in family legends and midnight confessions, the memory survived. Graves opened, hearts burned, ashes swallowed. They called it a cure. History calls it a panic. But under the surface of that panic was a kind of terrible faith, the belief that the living could bargain with death if they were willing to pay enough. And the graves they opened were only the beginning. The snow had melted into thin gray ribbons when they carried Mercy Brown's coffin from the hill in Exeter, Rhode Island. The year was 1892, and the last true vampire hunt in American history was about to begin. Not in legend, not in superstition whispered by firelight, but in front of witnesses, ministers, and reporters. It started with a family that couldn't stop dying. George Brown was a farmer, quiet and practical, not given to foolish tales. Tuberculosis had already taken his wife, Mary, and his eldest daughter, Mary Olive. His son Edwin, once broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, began wasting in the same way. Blood on the handkerchief, hollow cheeks, the slow disintegration that people had learned to fear as much as famine. Only one daughter remained at home, Mercy Lena Brown, 19, pale but lively even through that terrible winter. Then in January, she died too. For a short while, it seemed the sickness might have ended with her. The ground was frozen, so Mercy's coffin was placed in the crypt behind the church, waiting for spring. But Edwin's health worsened, and people began to murmur. The old talk returned, the idea that one of the dead was feeding on the living. Some said they saw shadows moving at the Brown homestead after dark. Others claimed the boy spoke of feeling someone sit on his chest while he slept. By March, George Brown faced the question every desperate parent had faced before him. Would he open the graves? He resisted. He was a man of reason, not ritual. But when your son is dying and neighbors whisper that the cure is buried in your own yard, reason bends. On March 17, 1892, George and several townsmen, accompanied by the local doctor, Harold Metcalf, went to the cemetery on Chestnut Hill. The doctor carried his instruments. The men carried shovels.
They opened 3 graves. First came Mary, the mother, only bones. Then Mary Olive, the eldest daughter, the same. Then they turned to Mercy. Her coffin was drawn from the crypt, not the ground, and when they pried it open, the sight froze them. Mercy's body looked untouched by decay. Her hair had grown dark and heavy. Her face still held color. And most chilling of all, when the doctor cut into her chest, the heart and liver appeared full of dark liquid blood. The townsmen stepped back. One murmured a prayer. Someone else muttered, "She's feeding on him." The doctor explained that Mercy's preservation was natural. The cold had kept her body from decomposing, but no one was listening anymore. The explanation was too neat, too modern, too small for the terror they felt. George Brown gave his consent. They removed Mercy's heart and lungs, burned them on a nearby rock until they turned to ash, then mixed those ashes into water. Edwin drank that mixture, believing it might break the curse. The people stood by, silent and hopeful. For a week afterward, he seemed steadier, as though the darkness had been pushed back. But within 2 months, he was gone too. That should have been the end of the story. Another local tragedy buried beneath the snow. But the world was changing. News traveled faster now, by telegraph, by newspaper, and what had once been a private act of superstition became national spectacle. Reporters arrived from Providence, Boston, even New York. They called it a vampire scare in Rhode Island. They printed the details, exaggerated and lurid. Heart found full of blood, rural folly among the farmers. The educated sneered. The preachers wagged their heads, but the story sold. People read it in parlors by gaslight and shivered. And across the ocean, a writer in England took notice. Bram Stoker was collecting folklore while working on a novel about the undead. Among the clippings in his notes, researchers later found references to the Mercy Brown case. It may have been a coincidence, or perhaps Mercy's grave helped give Dracula his breath. In Exeter, life went on. The cemetery returned to quiet. Grass grew over the disturbed earth. Mercy's headstone stood straight, the chisel marks still fresh. Her name and the date, 1892, mark the final year of America's vampire panic. But the story refused to stay buried. Visitors came, then tourists. Local children dared each other to touch her stone after dark. Modern investigators brought cameras, measuring tools, questions science still couldn't quiet. Why had her body resisted decay so long? Why had the heart seemed full? The rational answers, temperature, moisture, preservation, are tidy, but tidy answers rarely soothe old fear.
Today, Mercy Brown's grave still stands at Chestnut Hill, covered in small gifts left by strangers, coins, letters, flowers, bits of red ribbon. Some visitors say the ground feels colder there, the air heavier. Others claim to hear faint breathing when the wind passes through the pines. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's memory. Mercy Brown never asked to be anyone's monster. She was a farmer's daughter who died of a disease no one yet understood. But her story marked the last time America mistook illness for the hunger of the dead, and the last time a coffin was opened in the name of love disguised as fear. Her legend endures because it sits at the meeting point of science and superstition, a reminder that the heart sometimes refuses to believe what the mind already knows. And somewhere in those Rhode Island hills, when the fog rolls low and the moon rises pale, you might still feel that old question drifting from the trees. What if the doctor was wrong? There is a kind of silence that only comes when the living disturb the dead. It's the sound between heartbeats, between shovel strikes, between the gusts of wind that lean against a graveyard wall. That silence filled New England's frozen nights through the 1800s. Nights when fear, grief, and desperation sent men up the hill with lanterns and spades. They called them removals or precautions, never desecrations. That word was too sharp, too close to sin. What they did, they told themselves, was mercy, a bargain struck between love and terror. In every small town, the story began the same way. a sickness that refused to stay in one body. The mother died, then the sister, then the son began to fade. The doctor said consumption. The neighbors said something else. "She's feeding on them," they whispered, or "He's not done yet." By midnight, the decision would be made. The burial grounds were never far. New England built its churches and cemeteries close to home, as if to remind the living that death was part of the household. Stone walls crumbled under frost, iron gates leaned, and the headstones, tall, narrow, inscribed with weeping willows, pointed like fingers toward heaven. Lanterns swung between them, shadows bending in impossible shapes. There were no undertakers in those rural villages, no city morgues to stand between grief and the grave. Families buried their own, and when fear took hold, they exhumed their own. A few men would go first, usually kin. Sometimes a neighbor followed, the kind of man who owned an axe and a guilty conscience. They would carry their tools in sacks to muffle the clatter of iron. Someone always carried a Bible, though it rarely opened.
The ground was hard in winter. The sound of digging carried, muffled but steady, the sound of resolve wearing itself thin. Breath turned to smoke, hands blistered inside their gloves. Someone murmured a hymn under his breath, half prayer, half apology. When the coffin was reached, they would pause. Always that pause. Even fear respects ritual. The doctor, if there was one, might step forward with a small air of authority that reason lends to madness. He would explain, for anyone listening, that they were looking for signs, signs that the corpse was not as it should be. The lid came open with a groan. The lantern light slipped inside. And there she was, or he was, a face once beloved, now slack and unfamiliar. But sometimes the face looked wrong in a different way. Skin that seemed too fresh, eyes half open, blood where there should be dust. The kind of sight that makes a man doubt what he knows of the world. Science can explain those things easily now. The gases of decay cause bloating. Cold preserves. Blood seeps and darkens. Hair and nails appear longer because the skin shrinks. But those explanations belong to a century not yet born. In that moment, the villagers saw only evidence of hunger. The ritual followed its own order. Some took the heart, others the lungs. In certain counties, the entire chest was opened. In others, only a small incision was made. The heart was placed upon a flat rock or a blackened shovel blade. A fire was built beside the grave, and the flames licked it clean. The air filled with a smell no one could forget. Not the sweet smoke of wood, but the thick, metallic scent of burning flesh. The ashes were gathered carefully, reverently. In the light of the fire, they looked like crushed iron filings. These were mixed into water, or milk, or sometimes even broth. The sick drank. They drank because they were told it would work, because they wanted to live, because faith sometimes needs an action more than an answer. In other towns, the ritual was simpler, but no less strange. The bones were rearranged, skull placed between crossed femurs, the skull and crossbones of warning carved in stone. The idea was to keep the corpse from rising, to trap its will within its own remains. Each town had its own way. In Woodstock, Connecticut, they exhumed Sarah Tillinghast's family after 12 had died. In Jewett City, they found entire graves disturbed, hearts removed, ashes scattered in the woods. These were not isolated fits of madness. They were traditions passed quietly from valley to valley through church pews and kitchen whispers. And yet, for all its horror, the act was never cruel in intent. It was grief in motion, the living trying to make sense of what had broken them. They were not hunting monsters. They were searching for mercy, and in their desperation, mercy took a monstrous shape.
There are journals from those years, brief, tight-lipped accounts written by ministers and town clerks. They record the events in the plainest words, as though simplicity could hide the unease between the lines. At midnight, exhumation performed. Signs of recent vitality observed. Organs removed and burned. Family satisfied. Satisfied. That single word says everything. By dawn, the graves would be closed again. The men would trudge home with soot on their hands. The women would watch the horizon, waiting to see if the coughing stopped. If it did, they would thank Providence. If it didn't, they would whisper that the wrong grave had been opened. The world of reason would come later, bringing microscopes and medicine and names for things that had only been fears. But for those long nights beneath the cold stars of New England, the line between faith and horror was drawn with a shovel's edge. Some graves stayed undisturbed for centuries. Others bear the marks even now, bones rearranged, hearts missing, skulls placed neatly atop ribs. Archaeologists call them vampire burials, but those who remember the stories call them something simpler: evidence of love's last attempt to fight the dark. Because the truth is this: the vampire panic was never about the dead rising. It was about the living refusing to let go. And on those nights of midnight exhumations, the living and the dead met halfway, bound together by fear, hope, and the terrible beauty of belief. Before the graves were opened, before the fires burned on the hills, fear was born inside the houses. It started quietly, in corners of rooms that smelled of smoke and soap, in the tick of the clock and the sound of coughing that refused to stop. Farmhouses in 19th century New England were tight worlds. The walls were made of pine and whisper, thin enough that one person's sorrow leaked into every room. When sickness came, it filled the house like a fog. It touched the dishes, the blankets, the Bible on the table. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone could taste it, the metallic tang of fear, the feeling that something unseen had already chosen its next victim. Every small noise became a sign: the hinge that creaked when the wind moved it, the whisper of the dog growling at nothing, the child who said she dreamed of her dead sister standing by the bed, smiling but not warm. Even the light seemed different, paler, thinner. Consumption didn't come all at once. It crept. First, there was a loss of appetite, then the night sweats, then the slow, dry cough that rattled through the boards. The sick looked almost beautiful at first. The fever painted their cheeks red, their eyes brightened with an unnatural shine. People said it made angels out of them. Then they began to fade, day by day, until their voices were soft as paper. Mothers stayed up late by the fire, boiling herbs, praying. Fathers made trips to town for tonics that did nothing. Ministers visited, leaving words of comfort that turned to ashes before they reached the heart. And always there was the whisper from neighbors, maybe it's not just sickness. At first, families ignored it. To name the thought was to give it power. But when another child started coughing, when the father's shoulders began to stoop, when the house seemed colder, even with the stove burning, that whisper turned into a certainty. "It's her," they said. "It's him," someone else whispered. "The dead are not at rest." They remembered stories told by grandparents who came from the old country. stories of revenants, of those who rose from their graves to drain the life from kin. They remembered the way the old folks used to drive stakes through the hearts of the wicked, or turn the bodies to face downward in the earth so they could not find their way home. And in the dim light of the farmhouse, such tales didn't sound foolish. They sounded possible. A man might go to fetch the minister, but the minister was often no help. Some were too afraid to interfere. Others believed the same stories in secret. When faith faltered, superstition filled the silence. The women saw it first. They were the ones who sat beside the bedside, holding the hands that grew colder each night. They were the ones who watched the color fade from lips, only to return in the dreams that came after burial. One mother wrote in her diary, "He visits me still, and I am weaker each dawn." She did not mean memory. Fear changed the rhythm of daily life. The chores continued, milking, mending, chopping wood, but all of it happened beneath a shadow. Doors were locked not against thieves, but against something older. Windows were crossed with ash on Good Friday. Garlic hung by the lintel, though no one said why. In some houses, people began sleeping in shifts so that someone would always be awake to watch the sick. Others moved their beds downstairs, away from the windows. Children were told not to play near the barn at dusk, for that was when the dead might walk. And still, the coughing went on. Then came the night when the fever broke into delirium. The sick would sit upright suddenly, eyes glassy, lips whispering names. They would point to corners no one else could see. One man cried out, "She's here! She's come for me!" before falling back, trembling, as his wife screamed. The family knew what that meant. The next day, someone would go to the neighbor's house. The talk would begin. The plan would take shape.
It wasn't only illness they feared, it was betrayal. The thought that someone they had loved, someone whose body lay just yards away, could now be feeding on them. The fear was personal. It came with a name, a face, a memory. That's what made it unbearable. Sometimes the fear turned inward. The ones who felt themselves fading began to wonder, am I next to rise? They would beg their families to cut out their hearts after death, to burn them, to make sure they could never harm anyone. Better safe, one dying woman whispered to her sister. Better ashes than hunger. Outside, the snow fell softly, blanketing the roofs of the farmhouses. To anyone passing by, the towns looked peaceful. Smoke curling from chimneys, the glow of lamplight behind frosted windows. But inside those homes, sleep had become a stranger. Men dreamed of graves that sighed open like mouths. Women woke with the weight of invisible hands on their chests. Children whispered that they heard their dead brothers breathing under the floorboards. Every small sound in the dark could mean something. Every shadow was a warning. Every cough was a countdown. And when the sickness claimed another, the family knew what would come next. There would be a gathering. There would be talk. There would be lanterns moving up the hill. The fear that began in the farmhouse would end in the cemetery. Because in New England, the dead did not rest easily, and the living had forgotten how to. By the late 1800s, medicine was learning to speak a new language, a language of microscopes that could see what fear had always felt. But in the farmhouses of New England, that language hadn't yet arrived. Doctors still traveled with leather bags, horse-drawn through snow, carrying more faith than knowledge. And when they knocked on doors shadowed by the sickness, they faced a war between two worlds, science and superstition, both desperate to save the same life. They were called village doctors, although many had only half a degree or none at all. They learned from mentors, not universities,
from bodies, not books. Their instruments were few: a stethoscope, a thermometer, a bottle of laudanum, and a pocket Bible, just in case. But what terrified them most wasn't what they couldn't cure, it was what their patients believed instead. Consumption, tuberculosis, was the great thief. It stole one by one, sparing no family, defying every poultice, every tonic. The physicians wrote in ledgers fever, pallor, hemoptysis. They drew sketches of lungs as though mapping a battlefield they had already lost. They believed in bad air, miasma, humors turned sour. They carried vinegar to cut the smell of sickness and filled houses with camphor and smoke. And when the dying whispered of dreams filled with pale faces at the foot of the bed, the doctors did not answer. Some tried to reason with the townsfolk. They spoke of contagion, of breath and blood, of infection passed like whispers through the household. But no one wanted to hear that the disease was invisible. Invisible things couldn't be fought with fire or shovels. Invisible things couldn't be fed to the sick as antidote.
So when the exhumations began, the doctors were often summoned, not to stop them, but to witness. Their presence made the ritual respectable. Their silence made it sacred. One such doctor was Harold Metcalf of Exeter, Rhode Island, the man who stood beside George Brown when they opened Mercy's coffin. He had been trained in Providence, studied anatomy, and knew well that cold could preserve the flesh. He knew the heart could still hold blood without beating. Yet when the men turned to him and asked what it meant, he hesitated. Science, he realized, had no words that the cold and hungry could hear. So he said nothing. The line between doctor and priest blurred easily in those years. Both dealt with mysteries, both faced families at the edge of despair, both offered explanations that began with faith. The difference was that the priest dealt in souls, the doctor in bodies. And when bodies behaved strangely, the two professions met at the same grave. Other doctors did not stay silent. In Vermont, Dr. John Hastings Hurlburt wrote furious letters to the papers condemning the heathen practice of exhuming the dead. "It is not witchcraft that kills," he wrote, "but infection that moves from mouth to mouth." But the public had little use for words that didn't end in cure. In their notebooks, many physicians betrayed their own doubts. Could it be inherited? Could it be the climate? Could it be the grave? They scribbled such questions between doses and deaths, trying to keep the candle of reason lit while the wind of panic howled around them. When the germ theory finally reached the American countryside, it came not through universities, but through pamphlets, lectures, sermons, the same channels that once carried the stories of vampires. And even then, belief changed slowly. Science had arrived too late for hundreds of families who had already buried, burned, and fed the ashes of their loved ones. But the doctors remembered. They remembered the smell of winter graves, the faces of men holding torches, the strange alliance between fear and faith. They wrote about it quietly, in journals that would later astonish historians. One physician in Maine confessed, "I stood by while they cut her open. I said nothing. They were gentle, as though performing surgery. I envied them their certainty." Medicine's progress is often measured in cures, but sometimes it must be measured in silences. The moments when knowledge stands aside and watches the old world finish its rituals. And in that silence, the vampire doctors learned a truth that science rarely admits, that logic does not always heal, and sometimes belief itself is the only medicine people can swallow. When dawn came, they washed their instruments, repacked their bags, and rode home through the snow. Behind them, the smoke from the burned heart thinned into the air, and they wondered, not for the first time, whether they had seen a superstition die or merely watched it change its name.
They called it a cure, a desperate, sacred, unholy cure. When the sickness gripped a town and logic failed, fire became the final medicine. In the dark corners of New England's fading 19th century, entire communities took part in rituals they swore would end the dying. They didn't think of it as horror. They thought of it as survival. Word spread quickly when someone seemed to recover. In a world ruled by hearsay, one story could become law overnight. They burned the heart, people whispered, and the boy lived. Whether it was true didn't matter. Hope doesn't need proof. It only needs company. So they gathered again, fathers, sons, doctors, ministers, all pretending not to see what they were about to do. The dead lay before them, the air sharp with frost and smoke. A heart once pulsing with love now held the promise of healing. The ritual began quietly. The chest opened under trembling hands. Someone fetched a flat stone or a shovel and built a small fire, kindled with pine and straw. The organ was laid upon it like an offering. The smell came first, acrid, sweet, unforgettable, then the hiss of blood meeting flame. No one spoke until it was done. When the heart turned to ash, they mixed the remains into a cup. Water, wine, or milk, whatever the house had left. The sick drank, lips gray, eyes hollow. No one ever described the taste. Some said it was bitter. Others said it was like swallowing metal. But those who drank did so willingly. They believed the ashes would turn the sickness back, that the dead would finally rest and release them. In many towns, the act took place under supervision. A doctor or minister would be present, both uneasy, both pretending this was a kind of treatment. The physician could record it as a local remedy. The minister could call it a purification. Each hoped it might work, if only to keep the town from tearing itself apart. There are records, neat, dry sentences written in clerks' ledgers that could not hide the terror underneath. Heart removed and consumed in accordance with the wishes of the family. Patient's condition unchanged. Unchanged. But they kept trying. One of the most detailed accounts came from Woodstock, Connecticut. The family of the young girl Sarah Tillinghast lost nearly all their children to the wasting sickness. Convinced one of the dead was draining the rest, they opened the graves. A local paper later wrote that the hearts were consumed and thus the plague abated. It didn't, but for a little while the survivors believed it had, and belief was the only medicine stronger than despair.
In other villages, the ashes were not drunk, but scattered. Some placed them in the hearth to mix with the family's fire. Others buried them under doorsteps, sealing the home from further death. It was part medicine, part magic, and entirely human. If a stranger passed through those towns, he would never have guessed. The houses looked ordinary, the fields quiet under snow. But beneath that stillness lay the memory of the cure, the faint metallic scent of burned blood that the wind carried through the barns and orchards. What drove people to it was not madness, but mathematics. A family of 7 reduced to 3 in a year, another to 1. The numbers left no time for debate. When science offered no remedy and prayer offered no reply, fire offered something tangible. You could see it burn. You could smell the result. You could believe it was working. It's easy now to look back and call it barbaric, but to them it was an act of mercy, even love. They weren't killing their dead again. They were freeing them. They believed the ashes returned the balance, that the bond between the living and the dead could be reset. In many of these towns, the rituals were passed in silence afterward. No one spoke of them in daylight. Children grew up hearing half-remembered fragments, like, "Your grandfather helped on the hill," or "We don't go to that grave." But at night, when a cough echoed through thin walls, the memory of that cup returned. a few who drank lived longer. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was willpower. Or maybe, as the dying often believe, it was the thought itself that the dead had been appeased. When doctors finally brought explanations, when Koch named the bacillus and sanitariums replaced graveyards as places of treatment, the practice vanished almost overnight. But for half a century, those who lived in the valleys of Rhode Island and Connecticut carried a strange mix of shame and pride. They had done what they could. The last known case of ash cure came in the 1890s, not long after Mercy Brown. After that, the fires went cold. Still, even now, when the wind sweeps over old New England cemeteries, people say the ground smells faintly of smoke after rain. Not real smoke, memory smoke, the kind that lingers when belief burns hotter than truth. The town that drank ashes didn't just try to defeat death, it tried to make peace with it. And in that peace, terrible as it was, they found something we still seek today, a reason for why the innocent die, and a way to live with what reason cannot explain.
For all their hymns and sermons, the churches of New England were not built to hold this kind of fear. Faith was supposed to be stronger than superstition, stronger than the grave. But when the coughing started and the children began to waste away, even the ministers looked toward the hills with uneasy eyes. The Bible offered words about resurrection and eternal rest, but none about corpses that refused to decay. There were no verses for hearts that bled after burial, no psalms for shadows visiting in the night. So the clergy did what the frightened always do. They stayed quiet and hoped God would choose a side. When the first exhumations began, the ministers were caught between two worlds. To the townsfolk, they were the voice of truth. To the educated, they were supposed to be the voice of reason. But reason faltered where death lingered too long. In some villages, the minister condemned the practice from the pulpit, called it heathenish, unchristian, a remnant of pagan ignorance. Yet the next Sunday, half his congregation was gone, up on the hill digging graves. Others, faced with their own flock's despair, chose a softer path. They didn't endorse the rituals, but they didn't stop them either. They stood at the edge of the burial ground, watching, praying quietly while the shovels struck the frozen earth. And when the fire began, they recited verses about cleansing, renewal, sacrifice. Scripture can be made to fit almost anything if spoken softly enough. One letter from a rural pastor in Vermont survives. He wrote to a friend in Boston in 1854. I have tried to reason with them. I have told them that the dead sleep in Christ and cannot return, but they do not listen. They see their children fading, and they say, God helps those who help themselves. I fear their faith is a narrow bridge over a great darkness, and they are walking blindfolded. But not all ministers were reluctant. Some saw opportunity. A few claimed divine visions, warning that the dead had not yet ascended. They preached about sin unrepented, the restless soul chained to its flesh. To these preachers, the vampire was not a monster, but a symbol, proof that hell was close and the wages of sin were unpaid. Those sermons filled pews faster than any lesson on charity ever had. The churchyards themselves became uneasy ground. In the daylight, they were places of comfort, lined with lilacs and white fences, but by night they turned into theaters of dread.
The same crosses that marked salvation by day cast shadows that looked like gallows by lantern light. In some towns, ministers took to blessing the graveyards twice, once when a person was buried, and again after an exhumation, as though to apologize to the earth. They sprinkled holy water over disturbed soil and prayed that the dead would forgive the living's intrusion. Some whispered that the land itself was cursed, that the devil walked among the gravestones collecting debts. The silence of the church became its own kind of sin. By refusing to speak plainly, the clergy allowed two faiths to grow side by side, one written in scripture, the other written in fear. The first told people to wait for heaven, the second told them to save themselves before sunrise. In old diaries, a few brave ministers confessed the weight of that silence. One wrote, "I fear I have preached too much of mercy and not enough of madness. When reason fails, they will turn to old gods with new names." Another admitted, "I went to the grave with them. I said I went to pray, but in truth, I went to see if she would rise." Even the sound of bells changed meaning during the panic. They no longer marked weddings or worship, they marked the newest death. Each toll reminded the villagers that another might soon follow. And when the bell rope frayed from overuse, they said it was because the dead had tugged it from below. Years later, when the panic faded and the cemeteries grew quiet again, church records remained strangely blank. Few ministers ever wrote about those nights. Perhaps they feared ridicule, or perhaps they understood that to record such events was to admit that faith had not been enough. The official histories of New England mention revivals, awakenings, reformations, but not the midnight burials. The vampire panic slipped through the cracks of sanctified memory, left to haunt folklore instead of scripture. But the silence of the church still echoes. You can hear it in the wind that moves through old steeples, in the hollow sound of the bells that ring for no one. It is the sound of belief trying to survive its own doubt. Because in those years, beneath the hymns and the sermons, beneath the stained glass and the carved pews, every minister knew the same terrible truth. Faith is easy until death begins to look familiar, and when the dead start to look back, even the church forgets how to pray.
The vampire that haunted New England was not born in America. It crossed the ocean quietly, folded inside the minds and fears of settlers who carried with them more than just luggage and Bibles. They brought memories of the old countries, of Europe's winters, its graveyards, its tales of the restless dead that no priest or physician could keep down. To understand how the panic took root in the rocky soil of Rhode Island, one must look first to the lands those settlers left behind. Long before the New World had its vampires, the Old World had its revenants, spirits that rose from the grave not as ghosts, but as something half alive. In the Balkans, they were called Vampir. In Germany, Nachtseher, the after-devourer. In England, they were the revenants, those who walked again. And in each story, the pattern was the same. Someone died, and the living began to fade. The Slavs told of the blood drinker, pale and bloated, feeding on kin until the village gathered with torches to burn the corpse. The Germans whispered of the shroud eater, who gnawed its burial cloth in the coffin, and as it chewed, those above ground wasted away. In Ireland, they spoke of the Deargdu, a beautiful woman who returned to drain her lovers dry. Even the Greeks had their Grikolakas, corpses that refused to rot. All of these legends shared a terrible comfort. They made death personal. Instead of disease or chance, it was your own dead who came for you. The misfortune had a name, a face you recognized. Grief could turn into action. When these stories sailed to America, they changed shape. The immigrants who settled the rocky coasts of New England did not bring castles or noble bloodlines with them, only hunger, hardship, and the bones of their ancestors' fears. Here, the vampire lost its aristocracy and became something homelier. Not a count, but a cousin. Not a stranger, but a child.
And unlike Europe's tales of open graves dripping with blood, New England's vampires were quiet. They didn't stalk through the night or leave bite marks on throats. They lay in the earth, still and preserved, feeding invisibly on the vitality of the living. The fear was not of what walked, but of what lingered. This transformation tells you something about the New World. Europe's monsters came from feudal power, the noble who feasted on peasants. America's monsters came from the family. The enemy wasn't a tyrant in a distant castle. It was the person you'd buried last winter, the one whose picture still hung above the hearth. The Puritans and their descendants believed the soul went immediately to heaven or hell. There was no purgatory, no wandering in between. But when tuberculosis struck, when bodies stayed eerily preserved and the disease passed through generations, that certainty faltered. Even a stern Calvinist might glance toward the grave and wonder whether the soul had truly departed.
Belief, like blood, has a way of mingling. In the small towns of New England, folk tales from a dozen nations intermarried the way their people did. German settlers spoke of hearts that bled after death. The Irish whispered of spirits bound by unfinished love. The English recalled tales of bodies that groaned when turned in the coffin. From these fragments, the American vampire was born, part ghost, part superstition, entirely human. There were no professional exorcists here, no imperial decrees. There were farmers, preachers, blacksmiths, people who had to make their own rituals. They combined what they remembered from the old world with what made sense in the new. Where Europeans might drive stakes through the heart, Americans burned it. Where Europeans hung garlic in crucifixes, Americans mixed ashes into milk. The New World turned the vampire from a creature of sin into a creature of sickness. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about cause and cure. In the New England version, the vampire was a symptom, a spiritual contagion born of grief, not evil. And that subtle shift made it more dangerous. It made it believable. Even the newspapers reflected the fusion. Articles from the 1800s describe vampire panics, with both mockery and fascination, noting that the people of these regions retain much of their forefathers' superstitious nature. To the city readers, it was quaint folklore. To the rural families, it was survival instinct. What's remarkable is how isolated these events were. There was no mass hysteria, no mobs storming graveyards. Instead, the panic moved quietly from farm to farm, whispered across fences, confirmed in kitchen gossip. Each case was private, driven by love, not by hate. And yet, together they formed a network of belief that stretched across the New England hills, a shadow map of grief and ritual. Some historians say the American vampire is proof of cultural memory, that no matter how far people travel, they carry their old fears in their bones. The grave might change, but the darkness behind it doesn't. Others say it's proof of something deeper, that the need to make sense of death is universal, and if science fails, superstition will fill the void. The vampire of the New World was never meant to live forever. It was meant to explain. It was the bridge between mystery and medicine, between the Old World's demons and the New World's diseases. By the end of the 19th century, as doctors named the true culprit, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the old belief began to fade. But it didn't die. It simply moved. It left the graveyards of Rhode Island and settled into the pages of fiction, reborn in novels and theater, its teeth sharpened by imagination. And so the Old World's shadow found its final refuge in the New World's heart, proof that even in a land built on reason and progress, the ancient hunger for meaning never quite disappears.
Because when the lights go out and the body fails and the air grows thin, the old stories return. Stories of blood and belief, of hearts that refuse to stop beating. And every time we whisper them, the new world grows a little older. The first entry was dated March 1892. The ink had bled through the paper in places, as if the hand that wrote it shook too much to keep still. It was signed only with initials, J.H., and for more than a century, it lay forgotten in a trunk beneath the floorboards of an old farmhouse near Exeter, Rhode Island. The handwriting is unremarkable. What makes it matter is what it describes. March 17th, 1892. We began at dusk. The frost had not left the ground, and the spades rang like bells. George Brown himself came with us, though he looked as if he'd already been buried. The doctor followed with his lantern. We said nothing. A man should not speak on a hill like that. So begins what may be the only first-hand account of a vampire exhumation written by one who dug the grave. He was not a superstitious man. His earlier entries speak of planting, debts, weather. He worried about a bad crop and a sick cow. But once the disease came to the Brown family, his tone shifted. The entries grew short, jagged, as though the fear had stripped him from grammar. March 18th. I thought I knew the face of death. I did not. When the coffin was opened, the air was warm as breath. I saw the color in her lips. The others crossed themselves. I wanted to, but my hands would not move. That night, they burned the heart. He writes of it in the simplest words. It burned slow. The smell was like nothing earthly. They said it would save the boy. I prayed they were right. In later pages, the tone changes again. There's regret, confusion, and a creeping sense of guilt. He starts addressing the dead directly, as if writing might undo what they did. Mercy, forgive us. We did what we thought was love. If you rest easy now, it is not because we earned it. Historians argue whether the journal is authentic, but every line breathes with the weary rhythm of those years when superstition wore the face of duty, and the gravedigger was not a villain, but a servant of mercy.
Imagine the man himself, his clothes stiff with cold, his breath showing in the lantern light, his shovel biting into frozen soil. He isn't driven by greed or bloodlust. He's driven by something quieter, exhaustion, fear, and the desperate wish for peace. He records the way the ground sounded hollow when the blade struck wood, the way the lantern flickered when they pried open the lid. He writes that one of the men whispered a hymn, another wept. None of them looked at each other. It is strange, he notes. A grave feels heavier when it should be empty. As the journal continues, it turns almost confessional. I have not slept. Each night I hear the shovel ring again. The others say the sickness has gone. I cannot tell. The boy still coughs, though quieter now. I think it is fear that makes him weak, not death. He dreams of the grave. He writes that he hears the lid closing and feels dirt on his own hands. In one passage, he swears that he saw her eyes open when the fire caught. Just a trick of the light, he insists, but I saw it all the same. By the final entry, the handwriting is barely legible. The ink trails into lines that look like scratches. April 12th. The snow is gone. The grass has begun to show. They say she is at peace now, but the hill feels wrong. I pass it when I take the ox to pasture. I do not look up. The ground remembers. If the journal is real, it is the closest we have to the thoughts of those who did the digging, the men whose names never made it into the headlines, who carried the burden of belief without the luxury of understanding. It reminds us that history is not written only by those who lead, but by those who labor under silence. The gravediggers were not fanatics or fools. They were men trapped between worlds, too practical for miracles, too desperate for reason. For them, every grave opened was a question asked without expecting an answer. Every fire was a prayer written in smoke. The journal ends without closure. The pages that should follow are gone, torn or burned. Perhaps J.H. could not bear to finish, or perhaps he did, and someone else decided the words were too heavy to keep.
Still, what remains is enough. It tells us what the newspapers did not, that the vampire panic was not only a public spectacle, but a private confession. It was the sound of shovels breaking earth while hearts broke above it. And in the ink of that nameless hand, we hear the truth no sermon or headline ever captured, that the line between savior and sinner is as thin as the paper it's written on. Somewhere under the cold New England soil, Mercy Brown sleeps. And somewhere in those same hills, so does the man who dug her up, both victims of the same fear, both forgiven by time. By the end of the 19th century, the great age of superstition was supposed to be over. Telegraph wires strung across valleys, trains thundered through forests, and the voice of progress declared that reason had conquered darkness. But in the farmhouses of New England, the old fears still lived beneath the floorboards. The vampire panic had not ended because of faith. It ended because science finally gave fear a different name. Before Koch identified the Mycobacterium tuberculosis in 1882, no one truly understood consumption. To most, it was still a mystery disease, a curse that crept from one bed to the next. Doctors could describe its symptoms, but not its source. They spoke of miasma, foul air rising from swamps or sickbeds, poisoning whole households. They advised fresh air and long walks, but the disease ignored their prescriptions. The sick continued to waste away, their blood bright against the pillow. When germ theory arrived, it was more than a medical revelation. It was an exorcism. For the first time, death had a shape so small it could not be seen. The enemy was no longer the dead returning to feed on the living. It was the living passing death among themselves with every breath. But new truths spread slowly, and belief, once rooted, does not die overnight. In towns like Exeter and Jewett City, the news from the laboratories of Europe felt as distant as the stars. Microscopes were rare. Microscopes did not bury children. The villagers trusted what they could touch, the weight of a coffin, the cold of a heart, the sight of blood. Fear still obeyed the senses, not the textbooks. Even educated men hesitated. Physicians who had read of Koch's discovery were reluctant to dismiss what their neighbors swore they had seen with their own eyes. How could invisible creatures explain the freshness of a corpse that had lain for months in the ground? How could a bacterium account for dreams of the dead standing at the bedside? Science could not compete with evidence you could touch.
And yet, the tide was turning. Slowly, painfully, fear was being translated. The same dread that once whispered vampire began to murmur new words: infection, contagion, quarantine. The rituals changed too. Instead of digging up the dead, families began to move the living to sanatoriums high in the mountains where the air was clean and the lungs could rest. The fires that once burned hearts now burned incense in hospital wards. The transformation was not easy. Some towns resisted, accusing doctors of arrogance for rejecting tradition. Others welcomed the change with relief. The same newspapers that once printed lurid tales of vampires now published reports on the White Plague, urging readers to wash their hands, to open their windows, to stop fearing the dead and start fearing themselves. It was an awkward kind of enlightenment. Germ theory didn't erase fear, it merely refined it. The monster had become microscopic. Where once a farmer feared his buried daughter, now he feared his coughing neighbor, his own breath, his reflection in a fevered mirror. In diaries from the late 1800s, you can read the confusion in the margins. "They say the sickness is not of spirits, but of dust," one woman wrote. "I clean the house, but the dust always returns." Another recorded, "The doctor says it travels in the air. Then how is the air to be trusted?" Science, it seemed, had given fear a new face, smaller, quieter, but no less cruel. Yet progress marched on. By the early 20th century, with vaccines and sanitation, the vampire panic finally faded into folklore. Doctors who once watched exhumations now lectured in universities. Their students spoke of Mercy Brown not as a monster, but as a victim of ignorance and disease. The old hills where fires once burned became quiet again, except for tourists and historians chasing the echo of superstition. But the lesson that science brought was deeper than the discovery of germs. It revealed something about the human heart, that fear will always find a body to inhabit. When we learn the truth about one monster, we invent another. The form changes, but the hunger to explain suffering, to make it tangible, remains. In that sense, the vampire panic was never truly about the dead. It was about control. To dig a grave, to burn a heart, to name an enemy, these were acts of order against chaos. When science replaced superstition, it didn't end the story. It gave it a new chapter. We traded wooden stakes for microscopes, prayers for petri dishes, but the ritual was light a lamp against the dark and hope it burns long enough to keep the unknown away.
Today, the world has conquered tuberculosis, at least in the sense that we understand it. But the fear that birthed America's last vampire has not vanished. It only hides beneath new names: virus, outbreak, contagion. Each time panic spreads, each time the news speaks of something invisible and deadly, the old memory stirs. We remember, without realizing, what it felt like to look toward the grave and wonder if the dead were still hungry. Science taught us how to fight disease. It never taught us how to stop imagining the worst. And so the story of the vampire panic ends not with a stake in the heart, but with a microscope lens, cold, clear, and merciless, staring back at the darkness, seeing at last what had always been there. By the time the world forgot the panic, the graves had already begun to keep their own secrets. They sat quietly beneath the birches and stone walls of New England, their stories buried with them, bones rearranged, ribs cracked open, skulls resting between crossed femurs like grim punctuation marks on a prayer. For nearly a century, no one spoke of them. Then, the earth began to whisper again. It was the 1990s when the first archaeologists stumbled upon one of the vampire graves. The discovery came not through folklore, but through accident. A family cemetery unearthed during a sand and gravel operation in Jewett City, Connecticut. Among the simple wooden coffins, they found something wrong. One skeleton, its skull severed and placed atop the chest.
its ribs broken inward as though someone had reached inside. To the untrained eye, it looked like desecration. To those who knew the stories, it looked like fear made permanent. The scientists called the man JB55 for the initials nailed to his coffin lid and his estimated age at death. The letters were all that remained of his name. Radiocarbon dating placed him in the mid-1800s, precisely when consumption swept the region. His bones bore the signs of tuberculosis, the lesions, the thinning ribs, but also the unmistakable aftermath of an exhumation. He had been unearthed and treated after death. The discovery sent ripples through the academic world. For years, historians had treated the vampire panic as exaggeration, a bit of local color inflated by newspapers. Now the bones themselves testified. The panic had not been metaphor, it had been flesh. More graves followed. In other parts of Connecticut and Rhode Island, archaeologists uncovered remains showing the same pattern. Skulls turned backward, bones rearranged, chests cracked open, hearts removed. In one case, an entire family plot bore marks of post-burial tampering. Each coffin opened, each body altered in a slightly different way, as though the living had been searching for the one guilty heart among them.
The scientists cataloged the evidence clinically, measurements, positions, soil samples, but even they could not help imagining the nights those graves had seen. The smell of damp earth, the flicker of lanterns, the whispered prayers and muffled weeping as the villagers performed their desperate surgery against death. When the analysis of JB55 was finally complete, the forensic report confirmed what folklore had always known. This was not random vandalism. It was ritual. The people who dismembered the corpse did so carefully, precisely, as if following instructions. They believed they were saving lives. And then came the DNA tests. In 2019, scientists traced JB55's lineage and found he was almost certainly a man named John Barber, a farmer and father who died of tuberculosis in 1826. His children had sickened soon after, and in their desperation, his neighbors must have opened his grave, rearranging his remains in the hope of halting the disease. They did not stop it, of course, but they left behind something more enduring than any cure: proof. The newspapers that once mocked the vampire superstition now printed sober headlines. Bones confirm folklore. Archaeologists unearth vampire burials in New England. Tourists came to see the sites. Students wrote theses. Historians re-examined diaries and town records long ignored. Beneath the modern roads and farms, the skeletons of fear were literally resurfacing. Not every town welcomed the attention. In some places, locals refused to say which hill held the disturbed graves. They said it was disrespectful or unlucky to name them. Others embraced the past, turning the stories into tours, their cemeteries into lessons in folklore and faith. But the bones did not lie. They told a story written not in words, but in gestures, the same gestures repeated across centuries: open, cut, burn, close, pray. The discovery changed how scholars understood the panic. It wasn't madness, it was method. The uniformity of the burials suggested a shared system of belief passed quietly from family to family. The people who lived through the panic were not isolated pockets of hysteria. They were part of a network of tradition as old as the fears they carried. Walking among those sites today feels different from visiting any ordinary graveyard. The air feels thick, the silence deeper. The names on the stones have mostly eroded, but the intent behind them has not. You can almost sense the moments of decision that played out there. The hushed meetings, the trembling hands, the unspoken hope that one more death might finally be enough to stop the others.
Some archaeologists who worked on the digs admitted to nightmares afterward. They dreamed of the faces of the unearthed, of lantern light on bone. One researcher wrote in her journal, "We came here to study the past, but the past is studying us." And maybe it is. The forgotten graves of New England stand as quiet monuments to the collision between reason and terror. They remind us that belief is not measured by logic, but by what we are willing to do when love and fear become the same thing. Each time a new burial is found, the same question echoes through the centuries. Did they save anyone? No record says they did. But each opened grave tells us something far more haunting, that even when death was everywhere, people still believed they could bargain with it, if only they could find the right heart to burn. Those bones will never answer. They lie in museum drawers now, labeled and cataloged, stripped of mystery, but not of meaning. Yet if you stand on one of those quiet hills at dusk, when the mist begins to rise and the crickets go still, you might feel what the archaeologists felt. The pulse of the earth remembering the moment when fear, love, and fire shared the same breath. The graves forgot nothing. It was only the living who tried to. When the last fires went cold and the ashes of burned hearts mixed into the New England soil, the panic seemed to vanish. The graves closed. The stories quieted. The newspapers moved on to new scandals and new deaths. But legends do not die the way people do. They change shape, find new lungs, new tongues, new ink. The vampire, reborn from Rhode Island's frozen fields, began its second life not in graveyards, but in books. By the 1890s, the American press had carried the Mercy Brown case across the Atlantic, where it landed on the desk of a theater manager in London named Bram Stoker. He was a quiet man, pale and meticulous, who collected clippings about strange events, cases of premature burial, blood rituals, and the folklore of the undead. Among them, scholars later discovered, was an article describing the Rhode Island vampire. The story of a daughter exhumed by her father, her heart full of fresh blood, was the kind of dark poetry that Stoker could not resist. When Dracula appeared in 1897, readers shivered at its continental horrors, never realizing that the soil of its inspiration had been dug not in Transylvania, but in New England. The Count's hunger for blood, his arrival by ship, his slow draining of families, all echoed the fears that had haunted the American countryside just a few years earlier. It was as if Mercy Brown's last breath had crossed the ocean and turned into fiction.
From then on, the vampire was no longer a superstition whispered by firelight. It became an idea with a passport. Europe gave it castles, capes, and aristocracy. America gave it guilt. Our version of the monster was intimate, domestic. It crept into bedrooms, took the shape of loved ones, and asked, "What if your grief could kill you?" In the decades that followed, the myth adapted to every age that needed it. In the early 20th century, when tuberculosis still filled sanitariums, the vampire became a metaphor for disease, consumption literalized. During the World Wars, it became a symbol of tyranny, of power feeding on the powerless. In the Cold War, it became a metaphor for ideology and control. And in modern times, it has become what it always secretly was, a mirror. Every culture finds its own reflection in the vampire's eyes. In some eras, it represents lust. In others, addiction or greed. In all, it represents hunger, the hunger to survive, to be remembered, to defy decay. The myth persists because it is elastic. It can stretch across centuries without breaking. But beneath all the glamour and immortality of the modern vampire
the soil of New England still breathes. The myth that rose from its frozen graves carried a quieter, more tragic heartbeat. It wasn't about eternal life. It was about the refusal to let death have the final word. When the archaeologists unearthed the skeletons in the 1990s, they didn't just find bones. They found continuity. The same rituals that terrified villagers in 1800 were still alive in the pages of our stories, our films, our metaphors. We no longer burn hearts, but we still try to purify fear through art. Every time a vampire film flickers across a screen, every time an author writes of the undead's hunger, we reenact the same ancient act, confronting death by giving it a name. The afterlife of this myth is not only in stories, but in the way it changed how people think about death. Once, the dead were feared as predators. Now, they are mourned, romanticized, even envied. We made the monster beautiful so we could live with it. We turned our guilt into fascination. The vampire who once symbolized the terror of contagion now symbolizes control, desire, and eternity.
But strip away the velvet and the poetry, and what remains is still New England. The cold, the coughing, the love that couldn't bear to end, the fear that became tenderness, the superstition that became story. The American vampire's true afterlife isn't in fiction at all. It's in memory. In the small museums of Rhode Island and Connecticut, you can still find fragments of the panic, newspaper clippings, family Bibles with blank pages where names should be, diaries that stop mid-sentence. These are the relics of belief, as sacred as any holy text. And perhaps that is why the myth refuses to die, because it was never about monsters in the dark. It was about how far light will go to find them. The people of New England burned hearts to save their children. We, a century later, light screens and candles and tell stories for the same reason, to hold the darkness still long enough to look it in the eye. That is the true afterlife of the vampire, not in immortality, but in endurance. A story that refuses to stay buried, a grave that keeps its heart beating century after century. Even after the graves grew quiet and the newspapers stopped printing their morbid tales, something remained in New England, a hush, a superstition, a tremor passed down through generations. The panic ended, but the fear did not. It merely changed its shape, softened into folklore, and settled in the bones of those who stayed. In Exeter, they still speak her name, Mercy Brown, though now it comes with a smile meant to hide discomfort. Tour guides call her America's last vampire. Teenagers visit her grave at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, leaving coins, ribbons, even lipstick marks on her headstone. At night, the air around that plot is colder than the rest of the hill. Cameras fog, phones glitch. Some say it's just the damp. Others say the earth remembers. But the curse of the vampire panic is not in haunted cemeteries. It's in families. Descendants of the victims and the believers still live in those towns, their surnames appearing on mailboxes and local registers. For them, the legend is not entertainment, it's inheritance. They carry the knowledge that their ancestors exhumed their own kin, burned their hearts, and fed the ashes to the dying. It isn't guilt they feel exactly. It's the heaviness of a story that refuses to be forgotten. One woman, whose great-great-grandfather attended the Brown exhumation, once said in an interview, "I don't think of it as horror.
I think of it as grief that ran out of places to go. Her words carry the truth that history books rarely reach. The panic wasn't just a series of rituals. It was a century of unburied sorrow. In Rhode Island and Connecticut, there are old houses where families once kept the sick in upstairs rooms, far from the hearth, windows nailed shut against winter air. The wallpaper still bears the marks of candle soot, the memory of nights spent listening for the last breath. In such places, it's easy to believe that fear leaves a residue, something that seeps into the wood, into the floorboards, into the bloodlines. A few descendants claim they still dream of the graves. In their sleep, they see fields of frost, lanterns, the hiss of fire. Sometimes they wake with the taste of iron in their mouths. The rational world offers explanations, but New England has never trusted reason entirely.
Local churches, once silent, now speak of the panic in half apologies. Ministers tell their congregations that fear is the oldest heresy. But some of the same cemeteries that once held the vampires are now sanctified ground. The line between curse and consecration has blurred. There's a strange poetry in how the land has healed and how it hasn't. Archaeologists say the soil of these old graveyards is unusually rich, fed by the ashes of both love and terror. Crops grow well near them, and locals joke about haunted fertility. Yet few plant too close. No one wants to find what the frost might give back. Even now, the curse lingers in the way New England tells its stories. The region loves its ghosts, its Puritan guilt, its candlelight tours of the dead. Every small town has a witch lane, a vampire hill, a plague hollow. The tourist maps point toward folklore, but under the laughter of the curious, there's still an old heartbeat. The living don't mock the dead here. They tread lightly. At twilight, if you walk through one of those cemeteries, you might hear more than the wind. It's a low hum, the echo of prayers once whispered over open graves. And if you listen closely, it sounds less like fear and more like forgiveness. Because in the end, the curse that lingers isn't a haunting, it's a memory. The memory of people who loved too fiercely to let go, who mistook devotion for deliverance. The memory of a time when fire was a form of prayer. The descendants of the panic don't light fires anymore. They light candles in church, or flashlights for ghost tours, or simply screens at midnight as they read about the girl whose heart refused to rest. Each small light is an echo of the same ancient need to understand the darkness by touching it. The curse remains because it never truly was a curse. It was compassion misread, grief mistranslated. And such things never disappear. They settle deep in stories, in names, in blood, waiting for another age of fear to call them back. One day, someone will uncover another grave, another heart, another legend, and the question will rise again, the same one that rose from Mercy Brown's coffin more than a century ago. Do we fear the dead because they return, or because they remind us that love never really leaves? That is the true curse of New England's vampires. They were never about blood. They were about memory, and memory, unlike the heart, never stops beating.
There are nights in New England when the air turns so still that it feels like the land itself is listening. The woods go silent, the barns creak once, and even the wind seems to hold its breath. Those who live near the old cemeteries say that's when you can hear them. Faint, low, a murmur beneath the frost. Not the voices of the damned, but of the remembered. The dead still whisper here. The panic is long gone, yet its echo moves quietly through time. The roads that once led to midnight exhumations are now paved and lined with mailboxes.
but the hills are the same, the stones are the same, and every so often, someone walking a dog or taking a shortcut through the woods feels that old weight, the same unease that crept through farmhouses more than a century ago. It isn't fear of vampires anymore. It's something deeper, the memory of what fear made us do. When you look at those graves today, the ones with names like Brown, Tillinghast, and Barber, it's hard not to imagine the moments that unfolded above them. The fathers with shovels, the mothers praying under their breath, the children watching from the road, unsure whether to be afraid or hopeful. They weren't monsters. They were survivors of grief. The whisper of the dead is not accusation, it's confession. If you listen long enough, it doesn't say, "You wronged us." It says, "You loved us so much, you couldn't stop trying to save us." That's the truth at the heart of the vampire panic, not horror, but heartbreak. The dead did not rise to feed, the living rose to fight despair. In the years since, New England has built a mythology from its wounds. The Salem witches, the restless captains, the haunted manors, all ghosts born from guilt that never settled. But the vampire panic was different. It was intimate. There was no crime, no villain, only devotion gone astray. Even now, storytellers return to it. Historians, filmmakers, novelists, all drawn to the strange, terrible beauty of those nights when faith and fear were the same thing. Every retelling is a ritual, another way to lift the coffin lid of memory and ask what it means to love someone past death. And perhaps that is why the legend still breathes, because it speaks to something older than folklore, the quiet hunger to believe that death isn't final, that we might still reach through the earth and hold the ones we've lost. The people of New England were not trying to destroy the dead, they were trying to bargain with eternity.
We like to think ourselves wiser now, armed with science and reason, but the pattern repeats. Each new century finds its own version of the vampire, a virus, a rumor, an invisible threat. We still turn on one another in fear. We still look for something or someone to blame. The form changes, but the whisper remains the same. What if it's not over? What if it's still here? The difference is that now, instead of burning hearts, we burn hours on screens, chasing explanations in the glow of artificial light. Our fires are digital, but the impulse is ancient. We are still trying to make the darkness answer us. And maybe the darkness does. At Mercy Brown's grave, visitors still come at dusk, leaving flowers and photographs, letters folded small enough to hide between the stones. Some thank her for the story. Some ask for protection. Some simply sit in silence. A few swear they hear footsteps on the grass behind them, soft and measured, stopping when they turn. No harm ever comes, only the deep, uncanny sense of being remembered by something unseen. That's what remains when the panic is stripped of its superstition. Not terror, but connection. The living and the dead, still tied together by the longing that created the myth in the first place. The whisper is not a haunting, it's an echo. If you stand long enough in one of those graveyards, the kind where moss grows over names and the stones lean as though listening, you might catch it, a rustle of air, a faint voice between the crickets. It isn't words you'll recognize, but meaning you'll understand. It says, "We were afraid. You are afraid. But fear is just love without a place to go." The vampire panic of New England was never truly about monsters in the dark.
It was about the grief that dared to believe in miracles, and the silence that followed when those miracles did not come. And that silence, that whispering hush between the living and the dead, is what still lingers. It's in the mist that rolls through Rhode Island valleys at dawn, in the cold that clings to the oldest stones, in the way every generation tells the story again and again, as if trying to rewrite its ending. But perhaps there is no ending. Perhaps the dead still whisper not to frighten us, but to remind us that memory is stronger than decay, that love does not die, that even in our worst mistakes, we were trying to save one another. And so the story remains. The graves are still. The air is cold. The world turns. Yet somewhere beneath that soil, beneath those centuries, the hearts that were once burned still beat faintly, not with hunger, but with remembrance. Because what New England called a panic was, in truth, a promise that we will never stop listening to the dead, and they, in their strange and tender way, will never stop whispering back.
The panic had long since sunk beneath the soil by the time the scholars came. The graveyards were quiet again, their stones softened by lichen and weather. The names, Brown, Tillinghast, Barber, were just curiosities to those who passed. But in the early decades of the 20th century, a new kind of pilgrim began to arrive in New England. Not doctors or preachers, but collectors of stories. They came with notebooks instead of shovels. These were the folklorists, the men and women who wandered back roads and town halls, listening to old voices that trembled when they spoke of the past. They were not searching for vampires, not exactly. They were searching for the shape of belief itself, for the way fear lived in the speech of those who had survived it. The first was probably Michael Bell, decades later called the man who hunted vampires. But before him came others, local historians, librarians, students with an ear for strange tales. People who understood that the real record of the panic was not in archives, but in memory. They found widows who still remembered the winter the Brown family died, farmers who swore their grandfathers had been there when the coffin was opened, children who had grown old still whispering of the fire on the hill. When asked why no one spoke of it sooner, most gave the same answer. We weren't proud of it. The folklorists understood. They didn't judge. They wrote everything down. The words, the pauses, the way the tellers looked at the floor when they reached the part about the heart. Some of them compared the stories to old world legends and realized what historians had missed. The New England vampire panic wasn't an imported myth. It was a rebirth, an American child of European superstition, shaped by hardship and isolation. In a way, those who gathered the stories were exorcists of a different kind. They did not burn the dead, they resurrected the truth. Each interview, each essay was a small act of absolution. When Michael Bell began his research in the 1980s, he found traces everywhere. Newspaper clippings yellowed to gold, diary entries folded inside family Bibles, even a single locket said to have belonged to one of the victims. He drove from Connecticut to Vermont, Rhode Island to Maine, following the same roads where the old wagons once rolled toward the cemeteries. Every town had a rumor, every hill a shadow.
The descendants, cautious at first, began to talk. Some invited him into their homes, offering tea and fragments of memory. Others warned him not to dig, literally or figuratively. But Bell persisted, collecting not only accounts of vampires, but of how the fear itself had survived. He found that the panic had left its print on language. Words like consumption carried echoes of curse, and phrases like, "the sickness is feeding again," had lasted long after anyone believed them. He published his findings in lectures and books, showing the vampire panic not as isolated madness, but as a cultural symptom, a kind of folk epidemiology, born from grief before germ theory. The academic world listened. For the first time, the people once mocked as superstitious were seen with compassion. They hadn't been ignorant, they had been desperate. In the decades that followed, universities sent more researchers into the field. They photographed cemeteries, mapped burial grounds, and compared patterns of disturbed graves. They discovered that nearly every town touched by the panic lay along old trade routes, places where disease could travel as easily as stories. The vampire had followed commerce like a shadow. What the folklorist brought back was more than data. They brought empathy. Their work rehumanized the panic. They wrote of families who had lost everything and still found the strength to hope in rituals that now seemed barbaric, but were at their core expressions of love. One researcher described standing in Chestnut Hill Cemetery at dusk, recorder in hand, listening to an elderly woman recount her grandmother's version of the Mercy Brown story. When the tale ended, the woman fell silent for a moment, then said softly, "I think they were just afraid of forgetting her." The folklorist turned off the machine. Nothing else needed to be said. That's what folklore does. It rescues what history leaves behind. By gathering these memories, the scholars turned fear into testimony, superstition into anthropology. They gave the story back to the living, not as shame, but as inheritance. Today, those old field notes rest in university archives. Their pages smell faintly of dust and pine. The ink has faded, but the words remain. Accounts of neighbors digging in frozen ground, of ministers torn between faith and panic, of the night air filled with both prayer and smoke. Each transcript is a candle, keeping the memory lit without rekindling the fire. The folklorists did not find monsters. They found people. They found that the vampire was never a creature hiding in graves. It was the echo of love refusing to die quietly. And in their careful, patient way, they proved that even a panic, once understood, can become a kind of peace. Because to remember with honesty is the gentlest form of forgiveness. And the dead, if they whisper at all, whisper loudest when we finally learn to listen.
The history books claim the panic ended in 1892 with Mercy Brown, but history has never been good at endings. The fear didn't stop at Exeter's stone walls. It drifted north and east, through forests and small towns, into places where winter lasts longer and memory runs deeper. The graves still whispered, and some people still listened. In Vermont, the snow hides everything, tracks, secrets, sins. But sometimes, when the spring thaw comes, the ground gives back what it's been keeping. That's how they found the Pierce family graves in Woodstock. Locals had always spoken of the wasting that struck the Pierces in the 1830s. The mother first, then 2 daughters, then a son. Each died thin and pale, coughing up blood. When the last boy began to fail, the neighbors remembered what had stopped the sickness in Connecticut, and they acted. The graves were opened, and one heart, fresh and red, was burned on a stone. No one called it vampirism, not out loud. In Vermont, they called it the sickness eater. The idea was the same, the dead consuming the living, until the living consumed them back. Farther south, in Maine's cold valleys, there were stories that followed the same pattern. A fisherman's wife buried near Boothbay Harbor was said to have been unquiet. Her husband swore she came to him in dreams, her lips blue but moving, whispering that she was hungry. When he died soon after, the neighbors dug up the coffin and found her body twisted, her mouth open as if mid-breath.
They sealed the grave with salt and stones. The church called it gossip, but the villagers called it done. Connecticut, too, had its share of unearthed dead long before the famous case. In Griswold, a cluster of unmarked graves turned up in the 1990s during road work, the bones rearranged in the same way as JB 55s. The archaeologists said tuberculosis. The old-timers said, "We told you that hill was wrong." The pattern stretched farther than anyone admitted. In the quiet hills of Maine, in forgotten cemeteries in Vermont, even as far as the borderlands of New York, the same ritual appeared. Open the grave, check the heart, burn the remains. A map drawn from those findings traces a crooked line of fear through the rural Northeast, a geography of belief carved in frost and superstition. What made these hidden vampires different was their secrecy. By the mid-1800s, the panic had become embarrassing. The newspapers mocked it. Ministers scolded it. So when people still performed the old rituals, they did so in silence. Families gathered at night, under new moons. Neighbors swore oaths not to speak. The rituals moved underground, no longer acts of faith, but acts of quiet defiance against death itself.
In one diary found in Vermont, a man recorded the burial of his daughter and added only one line beneath her name. The heart was burned as precaution. No elaboration, no apology. For him, it was simply what one did, the same way a door is locked at night. Those who live in those regions today still stumble on reminders. A cellar built over an old burial ground, where the floor stones seem warmer than they should be. A farmhouse with a room that no one sleeps in because it feels too watched. In some places, they still hang mirrors opposite the bed, so the soul can see itself before it leaves, an echo of a time when reflection was a weapon against the undead. Even now, archaeologists find oddities, skeletons with limbs crossed, skulls turned backward, coffins lined with iron nails. Each discovery is a whisper from the hidden chapter of the American Panic, a reminder that the fear spread farther than any newspaper could travel. But the strangest thing about these hidden vampires is not that they existed, it's that they were forgotten so easily. Entire communities carried out the rituals and then erased them from their own memories, as though shame itself had sealed the graves. Families moved away, towns renamed, and the hills swallowed the truth until only the stones remained to tell it. And yet, when the folklorists came a century later, the stories resurfaced like roots after rain. Farmers who claimed not to believe in such nonsense would pause before speaking of a cousin buried twice. Children who laughed at ghost stories still refused to walk past the old cemetery after dark. The panic had vanished from the records, but survived in the bones of language. Phrases like restless ground and bad earth. Small verbal fossils of a fear too stubborn to die. Perhaps that is the real lesson of the hidden vampires, that silence is never complete. Even buried, belief has a pulse. In these quiet corners of America, the undead did not need castles or capes. They needed only isolation, winter, and love twisted into desperation. Their stories live on in the soil, beneath the clapboard houses and frozen fields, where reason once stopped and superstition began again. If you walk those back roads in the deep months of winter, you may see lights on the hills, lanterns perhaps, or tricks of frost. Some say they're just hunters. Others say they're the descendants, still keeping watch over graves that history prefers not to mention. Because every country has its shadows, and America's are buried close to home. Not in Transylvania, but in Vermont, in Maine, in Connecticut. Not in castles, but in cellars. Not in nightmares, but in memory. The hidden vampires of New England were never meant to frighten the world. They were meant to save it, one grave at a time. And in that quiet mission, fire, love, and fear intertwined. They succeeded, if only by reminding us how deep the human heart will dig to keep the darkness from spreading.
The hills of New England are quiet now. The stones lean, the names fade, and the grass grows tall where the fear once lived. But some shadows never die. They stretch thin across time, changing shape with each century, waiting for the next flicker of belief to bring them back into focus. In Rhode Island, tourists come with cameras and curiosity. They walk the paths of Chestnut Hill Cemetery, touch Mercy Brown's headstone, and whisper her name like a spell. They don't mean harm. They're chasing the thrill of a story too strange to be entirely dead. But behind their fascination lies a question older than any gravestone. Why do we keep resurrecting the things that frightened us? The truth is that we need them. Every generation finds its own way to call the dead back. The old fires that once burned hearts have become screens that glow at midnight, retelling the tale in endless forms. Documentaries, podcasts, novels, films. Each new version promises revelation, but what it really offers is connection. A bridge between then and now, between fear and fascination. In the age of electricity, the vampire was reborn again, no longer a corpse in a New England field, but a symbol. First a monster, then a lover, then a metaphor. The panic became poetry. The superstition became cinema. The villagers' whispers turned into dialogue. And through it all, Mercy Brown's name endured, not as a warning, but as a mirror. We are still terrified of the same things her neighbors feared. Death that comes too soon, sickness we cannot see, the idea that love itself might turn against us. Science gave us reasons. Art gave us ghosts. And between them, we've kept the myth alive not because we believe it, but because we understand it. The archaeologists who unearthed JB-55's bones found that the soil around him was rich with iron, trace evidence of the fire that once burned his heart. They said it meant nothing more than chemistry, but it's hard not to imagine that some part of that flame still lingers, a faint ember beneath the earth, waiting for someone to remember. In a sense, we've built our world on such embers. The same impulse that drove farmers to dig up graves drives us to preserve their stories. The difference is only in the tools we use. Where they carried shovels, we carry microphones. Where they lit torches, we light screens. The fear is the same. The need to look into the dark and say, I see you. Some nights, the old legends seem to breathe again. A power outage, a storm, a cough echoing through a quiet house, and suddenly the centuries fold in on themselves. We remember the families huddled by candlelight, the graves, the frost, the fire. The imagination does not need much to reopen what history has buried.
The vampire panic has become a curiosity now, a chapter in museum exhibits and ghost tours. But listen closely during those tours. The guides tell the stories with a smile, but their voices soften at the end. It's not laughter that follows, it's silence. Because everyone knows deep down that we would have done the same. Faced with loss, with helplessness, with a disease that stole one loved one after another, who among us would not try something, anything, to make it stop. That's the real haunting of New England. Not restless spirits, but recognition. The awareness that our ancestors' madness was simply love pushed past reason. At Mercy's grave, someone always leaves a candle burning. The flame trembles against the night wind, but never quite goes out. Locals joke that it burns on its own sometimes, even when the wax is gone. They don't check too closely. Some things are better left unmeasured. Because the shadows that linger here aren't curses, they're continuities. The same fear that once filled the farmhouses now lives in our questions about memory, mortality, and the stories we keep telling ourselves. We keep returning to them not out of superstition, but out of gratitude. Every retelling is an act of remembrance, for the girl whose death gave birth to a myth, for the fathers who dug with shaking hands, for the doctors who stood helpless between belief and reason. They built a story big enough to contain their pain, and we, a century later, still live in its light. Shadows never die. They only learn new ways to follow us. So when the night grows still and the fog gathers low over the hills, listen. The silence that follows is not emptiness. It's inheritance. The same heartbeat that once trembled under New England soil now lives in us, in every tale we tell, in every fear we forgive. The panic is over. The graves are closed. But the story endures, alive, eternal, whispering softly through the dark. And maybe that's what it always wanted.